Greetings, history lovers, the historically minded. I'm Philip W. Travis. Welcome to my YouTube channel, History Changes. In this brief video, I want to talk briefly about terrorism and the terrorism crisis that was really sweeping across Europe, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. Terrorism in the 70s and 80s, as it forms the historical roots of the modern war on terrorism in many cases, is part of my research specialization. So I want to talk a little bit about this, and I think it's a very important thing to think about, because while the definition of terrorism, is pretty straightforward, how terrorism is applied and how it is thought about and engaged in society today is different. It changes. And what do I mean by that? So, first of all, what is terrorism? Terrorism, of course, is the use of violence, particularly against civilians, civilian institutions, private institutions, out of a goal of achieving some kind of political concession from a government. Usually these are for ideological purposes, also for political purposes. So that's the basic definition. Now, terrorism as it evolves since the 1980s, it also has sort of a political connotation, in the sense that terrorism is often used as a way to classify militants, enemy combatants in some cases, to effectively justify a more aggressive type of war. And so when terrorism is sort of used, you hear this term used by a political leadership somewhere, and they say, these folks are terrorists and thereby we're going to do X, Y, and Z. It is really important that citizens think closely and carefully and critically about the individuals, the groups that are being discussed. Because sometimes, of course, the assertion of terrorism is quite appropriate to the actions and to the group. And other times, though, it might be a way of characterizing militants that are involved in a sort of asymmetrical conflict or an irregular conflict, as opposed to sort of the way you might traditionally define a terrorist group as a group that is sort of, has their sole focus on targeting civilians, soft targets for the purpose of achieving sort of ideological objectives. So it's really important we pay attention when it's used, because sometimes it is used to sort of justify more aggressive actions than might be acceptable if that allegation was not deployed in the sort of polity of the country in question. In Europe, in the 1960s and 70s particularly, there was a real rise in terrorist violence. And some of this terrorist violence was ideological in nature. Some of this terrorist violence was sort of spilling over from other regions, like the case of Palestine and Israel. And I want to talk a little bit, also about sort of how terrorism is dealt with then versus today as well. So I have a few examples of issues of terrorism in Europe in the 60s and 70s over here. The photo you see here is a mural from the Troubles, and this is a Northern Irish mural, from the Ulster Volunteer Force, which was a terrorist group involved in the Troubles, fighting the Irish Republican Army. They were responsible for maybe upwards of 500 deaths. Generally speaking, these were oftentimes random acts of violence, bombings, assassinations against Catholic figures in that conflict. And they justified, of course, terrorist violence as basically a struggle to keep Northern Ireland as a part of the United Kingdom, as opposed to it becoming unified with the Republic of Ireland, which was predominantly Catholic. The other example here is ETA. ETA was a Spanish separatist group from the Basque region. So the Basque region of Spain is in the northern parts of Spain. Probably the most famous city is Bilbao, in the northern area on the southern part of the Bay of Biscay near France. And ETA was a separatist group, and they were effectively using violence to seek to create a separation from Spain. They're a militant group. You have the Baader-Meinhof gang, as they're sometimes called, and they were a left-wing, really kind of like a crime syndicate in a lot of respects. Now, they were a leftist, they had a leftist ideology. By contrast, the Ulster Volunteer Force was a rightist ideology. Baader-Meinhof in Germany, they committed robberies, they committed assassinations. They, in many cases, were almost more like an organized crime syndicate. There was the Italian Red Brigades, and these are just examples, by the way. These are just examples. There's actually a number of others that you could talk about here. The Italian Red Brigades was a leftist faction in Italy, particularly in the 1970s, and and these are all dissolved, by the way, now, at least in any meaningful sense. I'm not aware that any element of these top four exists today. But the Italian Red Brigades was a leftist group, and they were engaged in, assassinations and various types of ideological activity in Italy in pursuit of a more far left opposition to the Italian government in the 1970s. And then I have Palestine-Israel over here, in part because the Palestine-Israel conflict in the 1970s, where we start to see the emergence of the use of terrorist violence in that conflict, it spilled over in other regions. And in some cases, these were incredibly infamous cases. In the case of the 1972 Munich Olympics, militants in Germany associated with Palestine kidnapped Israeli athletes in a very, very shocking and infamous case of terrorist violence. There were also Palestinian air hijackings that were quite frequent in the 1970s. And in the 1970s and the 1980s, hijacking of airlines was a fairly common method of terrorist violence. Now, the interesting thing about this, and this is one of the things I want us to think about. So today, usually when we think about terrorism, usually we think about actions that are non-negotiable, if you will, meaning that the major powers, like the United States, for example, affirms that it does not negotiate with terrorists, right? Under no circumstance does the United States negotiate with terrorists. That has been an accepted policy since the 1980s, really. Granted, the United States has violated that policy before. Reagan himself, who was associated with really the emergence of that policy, or at least the popularization of it, violated that own policy when it came to the 1985 Lebanon hostage situation that culminated in the background in the Iran-Contra affair. But generally today, most governments have a pretty strong policy that they do not negotiate with terrorists. Interestingly, in the 1970s, it was quite different. So, and I think about the negotiating side of things, terrorists, in some cases in the 1970s, perpetrate terrorist violence or terrorist actions as a method of achieving goals, in some cases more realistic goals, like the release of captives, for example. And you might negotiate on this. Whereas today, when we think about airline hijackings, I think we usually think about the absolute worst scenario for the people on those planes, right? We think about planes crashing into the ground or crashing into a building where everybody's killed. In the 60s and 70s and the 80s, terrorist hijackings usually involved redirecting the plane to another airport, and an airport that was maybe sympathetic to what they were doing, or a location that was sympathetic to what they were doing. And then they would have a negotiation. It would be like a hostage scenario. And these garnered huge news coverage. But ultimately, oftentimes, out of these scenarios, there were exchanges. And they negotiated with them. And there were prisoners from their side released, and the hostages on the plane would be released. And so you see the Israel-Palestine conflict really spilling over into areas of the world far detached from, just the Israel-Palestine region. Not only the Munich Olympic terrorist attack in 1972, but also, of course, with airline hijackings all over the world. Also, in addition, if you look at the Troubles is an example where you had terrorist violence being conducted, both sides, and the end result of that, of course, was a landmark peace agreement. They did ultimately negotiate over this, albeit they weren't maybe necessarily negotiating with the individuals that maybe personally perpetrated acts of terrorism. But it was an irregular, asymmetric conflict that was really characterized by terrorism as the central part of the violence. And it was solved through a negotiated practice. And that occurred, of course, the Good Friday Accords in the late 90s. Today, of course, it's far more, terrorism is, I think, usually a far more zero-sum type of scenario where terrorists engage in violent acts, again, to achieve some kind of political objective. These violent acts are usually not about, negotiating for principal aims, but perpetrating really major attacks on civilians. And then in response, of course, on the other side, a non-negotiation strategy from the state actors involved. And so terrorism has, how it is framed politically has changed, and how it is handled by both sides has also changed historically from the European terrorism crisis of the 1960s and 70s. And today, of course, you have much more of a zero-sum game. The allegation of terrorism or support for terrorism is often used, and sometimes used as a way to gain wider political support for aggressive actions against a particular place or people. It also is a case where terrorist violence is used, is often on a more destructive, larger, more extreme scale than it was during the 1970s, by and large. I mean, when you think about like the casualties, for example, of the September 11th terrorist attacks, for example, this was a massive attack. And so in a lot of ways, I think terrorism has become kind of a zero-sum sort of game that is a little bit different than the way it was in Europe in the 1960s and 70s. So it's really important, of course, today, as I said, when terrorism is used as a term to justify aggressive actions against another place and another people, that it's very important that citizens in democratic societies think very carefully and critically about what the allegation is, who it's being made against, and to the extent to which it is an accurate, inappropriate sort of characterization. So this week, if you're in my classes, we're going to be looking at the European terrorism crisis. Be on the lookout for a little response to this video. If you're not, please subscribe. If you're just watching this on YouTube, that's great. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this type of content, and I'll see you in the next video.